Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have all walked away from the International Criminal Court. They accuse it of being unfair, say it's robbing victims, and they also say that the International Criminal Court is threatening the accountability of Africa. So what is there to do? This is the debate that we're going to be discussing. I'm Tokunbo Salako, joining you on Africanews Debate. Now we go over. Well, should the rest of Africa follow the move of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso? That is the question that we're going to be looking at today, because the Sahel Alliance's decision has not come out of nowhere. For months, leaders in those three countries have been accusing the ICC of turning a blind eye and ignoring Western abuses while focusing almost entirely on Africa. Now, their withdrawal marks the first coordinated exit by multiple countries and comes at a time when the three nations are already cutting political and security ties with Western powers and forming new alliances, especially with big powers such as Russia. Now, this move has reignited the old question across the continent, and this is the question of, does the International Criminal Court serve Africans, or is it serving the uses of those it was meant to protect? Now, before we speak to our guest, Donald Deya, who's the CEO of the Pan-African Lawyers Union, first we're going to hear a report by Africanews last week on when those countries made the decision.
Three West African nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have announced their decision to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, ICC, denouncing it as a tool of neo-colonial repression. All three are ruled by military regimes that came to power in recent years via coups. They already distanced themselves from regional bodies like ECOWAS and now say the ICC has been selectively targeting weaker states while ignoring others. The withdrawal takes effect 1 year after notification to the UN Secretary General. Importantly, any ongoing cases or investigations that began before that date will still fall under ICC's jurisdiction. These countries also say they intend to establish indigenous mechanisms for justice and accountability, aligning legal processes more closely with their own values and claims of sovereignty. Human rights groups have expressed concern that the move may reduce international oversight of alleged abuses by both non-state armed groups and national forces, especially in countries grappling with conflict and insurgency.
Now, before we speak to our guests, let me just have a look and show you the results of a poll that we've been asking and carrying out here on Africanews. That's asking you the question of, do you think the rest of Africa should follow the path of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso and walk away from the International Criminal Court? Well, the results so far are quite overwhelming, with the majority of people who've responded to this poll saying yes, that the rest of Africa should walk away from the International Criminal Court. Well, let me remind you, of course, that that poll is not closed. You can still, of course, express your opinion, and you should express your opinion, because now I'm going to be asking the opinion of Donald Deya, who's the CEO of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. He joins me from Arusha in Tanzania. Mr. Donald Deya, thank you for taking time to speak to us here on Africanews Debate. Let me start by asking you, of course, the Sahel Alliance calls the ICC a tool of Western influence. Now, from your point of view, does this criticism have any substance, or is this more a political than a legal threat?
First and foremost, let me clarify that the three countries have said they plan to leave the ICC. They have not yet deposited any instruments of withdrawal from the Rome Statute. So for now, it is just an intention they have expressed. That said, indeed, the ICC has had some challenges in its first 23 years of practical existence. It has indeed concentrated on situations in Africa to the detriment of victims from other continents, situations in Latin America, situations in Asia, and of course, situations in the Middle East. It is good that in the recent past, indeed, it has opened cases and has opened cases, for instance, relating to Gaza and also relating to the Russia-Ukraine war, so that it is a bit more balanced. But it is fair to criticize the ICC in its first years that it concentrated on Africa and led to the perception or the reality that it was going for the weak states and avoiding powerful perpetrators. But the way to address this, in my view, and we can unpack this later, is not to walk away, but to reform the practice of the ICC, because the Rome Statute itself is pretty well drafted, and there are powers that are vested in the Assembly of States Parties of the Rome Statute, and the African bloc at 33 member states is the largest bloc in the Assembly of States Parties, and that is where to force the changes to ensure that all three organs of the court, the chambers, that is the judges, the registry, and especially the office of the prosecutor, is seen to have an even hand and be looking seriously at all atrocities wherever they may be committed in the world.
Now, you mentioned that crucial word, reform. Now, yes, you've made that key point that Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, for the moment, have just tabled this as a threat. But how can the International Criminal Court actually go about rebuilding its trust and confidence?
I think first is to demonstrate that it is dealing with all the major atrocities across the world. And then second, I think, is to improve its communications, and outreach, especially to victim countries, to explain to them in greater detail, and especially to victim communities, to explain to them in greater detail what it is doing, what are the level of investigations, when prosecutions are likely to be due, and to actually conduct prosecutions with the utmost professionalism and also competence. I, for instance, come from the Republic of Kenya, and I followed very closely when the Kenyan cases were being prosecuted. Obviously, those cases were eventually adjourned indefinitely because of intimidation and disappearance of witnesses. But there were other elements as to how effective the investigations and prosecutions were that arose, which we criticized. So more competency, more fairness, and much more interactive communications with the people and with the world at large.
Well, would you agree also that with the claim that, according to certainly the results suggest that from our poll so far, that the ICC does face this big problem of credibility?
Yes, the ICC does face a big credibility problem in several parts of the world, especially in the countries where it actually launched investigations and prosecutions, and some of them ended up being terminated, sometimes because of incomplete work done. And in other places where people are skeptical that it seems to be a tool of the powerful states to hold in line leaders from less powerful states from whom it wants certain things. So those perceptions do exist. But I think there are other elements that people should look at. People should look at the accountability gap that would happen if the ICC was not there. Because the ICC has had a deterrent effect in many countries. For example, my own country, Kenya, we went through a civil war, the beginnings of a civil war in January of 2008, following disputed elections. And in every election cycle thereafter, you can see that the political actors are very, very careful in how they manipulate political violence, because they know that they could end up before the ICC again. So it does have a deterrent effect, which has been useful to citizens from the global south, from the developing states, from democracies that are still works in progress. So that is why, for me, while I respect the views of other people, we, and especially the Pan-African Lawyers Union and my members, we were like, let's reform what exists. And at the same time, let's strengthen other accountability measures, including on the continent, so that we do not have this impunity gap for which our people really suffer.
Well, let's dig a bit deeper into that impunity gap now. I just want to look at a tweet we've received from Ilaria Allegrozi, who's the senior Sahel researcher at Human Rights Watch. And she says that the ICC withdrawal deprives people of a key avenue for justice and redress. And the ICC is a court of last resort when victims have nowhere else to turn with investigations in countries around the world. Now, those are sentiments that have been frequently shared and expressed by various people. So, this impunity gap, whilst the ICC perhaps seeks to redress and rebuild its credibility, what's going to happen to the victims?
That precisely is the problem if we allow this so-called mass withdrawal. Africa has 55 states. The UN, of course, right now recognizes 54, and one, Western Sahara, is currently recognized as a non-self-governing territory. But of these 55, only 33 are states parties to the Rome Statute and are therefore bound by the ICC. 22 are not. And in some of these 22 is where we see some of our worst conflicts that have taken place in the recent past, such as in the Horn of Africa. So it is important for me, if these three do successfully withdraw, that means we'll be down to 30 states parties and 25 non-states parties. That will already be bad enough. I think we should continue advocating very strongly for all 55 states, even the non-self-governing territory, as of now, Western Sahara, to join the Rome Statute. We do have other mechanisms that are potential on the continent. But it is important that we give as many citizens in Africa as possible the potential protection that could come from being part of the Rome Statute system. It's a disservice to them that they're not.
I'm very interested in what you said there about other mechanisms, and tell us more about what those potential other mechanisms can be, because there have been some talk of perhaps an African-led regional courts as well, perhaps ones working on national levels, which could be dealing with these types of complaints as well as giving some sort of succor to the victims.
Yes, indeed. We presently have an African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Arusha in Tanzania. That is actually the reason why even PALU, Pan-African Lawyers Union, the premier Continental lawyers body, has based itself in Arusha to be near the court. For now, it can only handle violations of human and people's rights and the obligations of states. There is a legal instrument known as a protocol that was adopted to give additional powers to this court to be able to handle international crimes. And unlike the Rome Statute system that only handles the crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potentially aggression, the African Court, should it come into force, should this additional jurisdiction come into force, will be able to handle 10 additional crimes, which include piracy, terrorism, mercenarism, trafficking in persons, trafficking in hazardous wastes, trafficking in drugs, and even unconstitutional change of governments, So this protocol requires 15 of the 55 states to ratify to come into force. As at the moment, literally 11 years after it was passed, only one state has ratified, Angola. And we're working very hard to get others to do. If that does happen, that means we'll have a court on the continent that will have the jurisdiction that the Rome Statute has, but we'll have a wider jurisdiction in terms of that one having 4 crimes, this one having 14, including what we call enabling crimes, things such as corruption, money laundering, and so on, that usually happen on the way to a genocide, And this is a court that then would be able to work in perfect complementarity with the ICC. So there'll be a continental court and an international court, which have the potential of working together and completely closing the impunity gap that we now see. But I said, as for the moment, only one state has ratified it. We need 14 more. So it's only a potential.
Now, if the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights actually, were to work, we're talking a lot about credibility of the ICC, of course, and so much of this, the credibility is based on sort of the perception and the views in that sort of great court of public opinion. Do you think, internationally speaking, this court is going to garner trust from outside and beyond the African continent?
I mean, that really is a question of how the court conducts its work. It has the potential, like all courts, to garner the trust.
Okay, sorry about that. So tell me, remind me of...
Sorry? I seem to have lost you.
Technical problem there. Do continue.
I'm saying, I said that for any court to gather the trust of the people, it depends on how the court conducts itself. Indeed, there are many Africans and friends of Africa, and even enemies of Africa, because we have those, who have skepticism that any African mechanism can work. But we've seen many African mechanisms work relatively well. The court as it exists, when it just has a human rights jurisdiction, has over the last 16 years of its existence delivered very powerful judgments on various issues of civil rights, political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, group rights, including rights of indigenous communities. So it has shown that it can be as competent as any court in the world. Right now, it is faced with a number of very important cases as in handling. For instance, a request for an advisory opinion on the question of climate change that the Pan-African Lawyers Union and the African Climate Platform filed just in May, and it will be heard over the next 1 year. So the potential for it to be completely respected by the people exists, and the challenge will be, should that court be operationalized, how it handles its first steps. Otherwise, I strongly believe that in many aspects, Africa and Africans have proven that they're as good as their counterparts from anywhere else in the world. So I would not necessarily place a skepticism on an African institution that I would not place on a sister institution elsewhere.
Now we're going to take a brief break just to look at another report which can help give some of our viewers and readers and people who are following this. Let me also remind those viewers who are listening to this debate that they too can still vote in our poll on whether the rest of Africa should follow the moves of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in threatening to leave the International Criminal Court. But first, without further ado, let's have a look at this second report on the work of the ICC.
It was the first time the court has convicted a suspect of crimes in Darfur. Prosecutors successfully argued that Ali Muhammad Ali Abdurrahman, also known as Ali Kosaib, commanded Janjaweed militia forces in Darfur that went on a campaign of killing and destruction in 2003 to 2004.
As demonstrated by the facts relating to the crimes, the accused played an active role in their commission. He encouraged and gave instructions that resulted in the killings, the rapes, and destruction committed by the Janjaweed in Kudum and Bindizi.
The three-judge panel ruled that the atrocities, including mass murders and rapes, were part of a government plan to violently snuff out a rebellion in the western region of Sudan. Abdurrahman was transferred to ICC custody in 2020 after surrendering in the Central African Republic.
Welcome back to the program. To anyone who's just joining us here live on Africa News, we're debating the question of whether the rest of Africa should follow the path that seems to be set now by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in threatening to leave the International Criminal Court. Joining me to discuss this in depth is Donald Deya, who's the CEO of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Thanks again for taking time to join us here on the program. But let me just ask you a question that just came out of the back of that report where we were just listening to. How would you assess the risk of external actors and Africa now and the role? I'm thinking primarily of Russia and China.
I mean, Russia and China are two of the states that have never signed up to the Rome Statute system from the beginning. Obviously, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine has. So for atrocities going on Ukrainian territory, then the International Criminal Court is entitled to investigate and even to seek to prosecute any actor, regardless of which country in the world they come from, and whether their country is a Rome Statute state party or not. because crimes are being committed on the territory of a state party. And it is for that reason that there's a live investigation and the prosecutions going on and arrest warrants against President Putin of Russia and a couple of other senior government officials in Russia. So it does show that the court can have some effect, even if its orders may not be immediately implemented, including simple orders such as arrest warrants, but at least the moral story that indeed a court of competent jurisdiction has indicted you, I think has value in the world. So I think this is important to know. I'd also like to go back to something else. The video that has been shown shows the investigations, many of them quite delayed, and the prosecutions, which now have resulted in the conviction of Ali Kushaib of the Janjaweed. And I'd like to make a statement here that had the world, including the ICC, but not limited to the ICC, worked harder on the atrocities that were going on in Darfur, which is in the western region of Sudan, we would not be where we are now with Sudan. Because the Janjaweed, which was a militia that was facilitated by the government of Sudan then and by the military of Sudan, the Sudan Armed Forces, is what has been transformed into now what we call RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. So had we gotten justice and stopped Janjaweed then, we would not have the Rapid Support Forces, which is one half of the serious conflict going on in Sudan right now between the Sudanese Armed Forces on the one side and the Rapid Support Forces on the other, which has created the world's worst humanitarian disaster. More deaths, more injury, more destruction, more sexual and gender-based violence going on in Sudan than is going on in Ukraine, Israel, and in Gaza, and a couple of other situations combined. So really, we should, and especially the states, make sure that they use instrumentalities such as the ICC and also the power of the UN Security Council to support the ICC to achieve accountability, but also to project deterrence, to be a threat enough to armed perpetrators who may want to kill people on an industrial scale. And this may make our world a more peaceful place.
Well, thank you for that statement. But you mentioned the United Nations. I mean, it's only just just over a week that we've seen the President of the United States lambast the role of that alliance, saying it's virtually useless. Are you looking to perhaps get extra support, perhaps from the European Union? Do you see it having a role in supporting the work of the International Criminal Court?
I think one of the most important things facing the world right now is we need a fundamental reform of the United Nations, and especially of the United Nations Security Council. I think that's one of the big things that the world should do. Yes, we've just come out of the UN General Assembly Week in New York. I was there personally with lots of other of my colleagues from civil society, engaging our various governments, engaging regional blocs such as the African Union and so on, and pushing for fundamental United Nations reform in our lifetime. One of the big challenges we face there with the UN Security Council is this veto power that the so-called permanent five, the 5 states that have permanent seats in the UN Security Council have. And that is the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And on many major things where the world, through the UN Security Council, could have acted very robustly, one state or the other enters a veto. So sometimes 192 of the states of the world could have agreed on something, and just one state stops it all. So that veto power needs to be removed. I know there are those who argument is that let's create more states that are permanent with the veto power. My own view is let's remove the veto power. So we actually do have a real democracy, and not a world where some states are more equal than others. So indeed, fundamental reform of the UN to make it more effective and to make the voice of each of the 193 states count equally is a very important task of our lifetime. And we've seen signs that especially if the global South unites and stays united and puts its foot down, then it can get changes made.
Well, in that sense, then, are Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso then right to threaten this move? Is it a question that without threatening to take this action, that those voices would just remain silent?
I think that the threat, I don't know whether I would use the word right, but I think that a threat of this nature is a good wake-up call to all of us, state actors and non-state actors, that we must do more to ensure a world where there's rule of law and democratic governance and legitimacy and service to the people, both inside our countries, in our sub-regions, and globally. Because otherwise, the people of Africa and the people of other parts of the world may vote with their feet and render us irrelevant. And the threat is real, because these three states, AES, have already walked out of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, because it felt, or they felt, that it didn't serve their interests. So it is very, very important that key actors, especially other African leaders, political leaders, but other forms of leaders, faith-based leaders, corporate leaders, social leaders, really engage in ensuring this meaningful reform. And this meaningful service, provision of public services to the people, health, education, housing, infrastructure, an enabling environment in which they can do their agriculture, they can do their trade, and so on, a reduction of corruption, and so on. These things are important, or people will walk out. But to the three AES leaders, I'd also say, you don't have, by yourself, as you're currently constituted, the legitimacy to walk out of the Rome Statute or really any other thing. You were not democratically elected by the people. We haven't formally asked the people of the three countries whether they want to walk out. So what we need to see is a return to them, a reform of the constitutions, a reform of the laws, a reform of the institutions, facilitation of free, fair and transparent elections, and electing then a legitimate leadership. And that legitimate leadership can now be the one to engage the citizens of those three countries on whether to walk out or not. This cannot be a decision that's made by a few men, because essentially men in a military junta that took power through the gun, even though they took power to protest other undemocratic dispensations that we had, that we should have confronted and addressed and redressed. And we, especially with the institutions, the African Union, ECOWAS, and so on, had not, So we do not begrudge that they took the gun to stop a constitutional dictatorship, but they can only be at best transitional leaders. They don't have the legitimacy to make such fundamental decisions on behalf of the people of those countries.
Okay, now as the CEO of the Pan-African Union, African Lawyers Union, I should say, would you say, in light of those comments you just made there, do you look across the continent and see one government, or perhaps more than one, where you think this government is perhaps setting the path that others should be following?
Yes, in terms of democratic rule and in terms of provision of services to the citizens, one can look, for instance, at the island states. Mauritius is doing pretty well. Seychelles is doing pretty well. Cape Verde is doing pretty well. On continental Africa, I would easily applaud the attempts being made by the government in Namibia, by the government in Botswana. So there are a number of governments that are doing pretty well. Much as I have some reservations with some of their conduct, I'm also a great admirer of what His Excellency Paul Kagame and his government have done in terms of how they fundamentally transformed a war-ravaged country that they inherited or that they took over in 1994. And in 31 years, you can see a phenomenal amount of reconstruction. And you can see some of the proudest people in the continent and some of the most patriotic people on the continent. There are some challenges, indeed, in which we'd like to have dialogues with. But in terms of what a leader, a committed leader can do, or a committed leadership can do, it is admirable. To the contrary, you could see our colleagues who inherited the newest state in Africa, South Sudan, and they've done nothing to try and build the country, except to ravage it even more. Till now, some citizens wish for the sort of colonialism they had when they had Khartoum ruling over them. But if we're to look, for lights, if we're to look for hope, I think a lot of it exists in the continent in terms of what can be done.
That's a very good positive message of hope there that goes out to all our viewers and the people who are logging into this debate, and that you are many. Let me just quote you now, one of our viewers who's watching this debate, who's responded to the poll, which I should remind our listeners and viewers they can still participate in. That's at Africanews.com. This comment here comes from PG Ghaffar Khan, who says, absolutely leave the ICC. It is noticed that arrest warrant was not executed for Netanyahu, of course, referring to the Israeli prime minister there, the demon Netanyahu. Israel's killing Palestine's children like birds. The ICC has lost all its credibility. Well, that is the question that we're answering here today, or looking to answer and explore. Should African nations follow the lead of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in looking to leave the International Criminal Court? And let me also remind you, our guest here on Africa News is David Deya, who is the CEO of the Pan-African Union, Lawyers Union. Well, let me just ask you now, because we've been discussing a wide range of topics here, as well as not only that question of what other countries can do, how the International Criminal Court can restore its credibility, but also the question of what could be done also, and how it's viewed from other countries now. So let me just ask you, while for the time that we've got you here, many critics say that the ICC disproportionately targets African governments, but would you say that the court does offer unique protection to African civilians that national courts often lack?
Yes. Remember that the ICC is meant to be a court of last resort. It only steps in when the national judicial systems are either unwilling or unable to provide justice, provide protection for the people, and ensure accountability for those who perpetrate crimes against the people. And remember that part of the complementarity provisions of the ICC is that it works and interacts with other national courts, with regional courts, and so on, and helps to strengthen them so that many problems can be solved at lower levels, and the ICC itself does not have to step in. So indeed, it is the obligation of many actors, including the ICC, to try and strengthen national systems and to challenge them to be able to provide justice and protection to the people. But where they fail to do so, then the ICC should be able to kick in robustly. Either the state refers itself, or the prosecutor of the ICC acts, what we call proprio motu, acts of her or his own motion. Of course, the current prosecutor is a man. The immediate former prosecutor before that was a woman, Fatou Bensouda, a respected lawyer from the Gambia in West Africa. So the prosecutor can act proprio motu, or other bodies, including the UN Security Council, can refer a matter to the ICC and request that it investigates. And where it finds culpability, it seeks prosecution. So I argue that we need a stronger ICC rather than a weaker ICC. And I argue that the African states, 33 of whom currently are states parties and form the biggest bloc, can actually use their power as states parties through the Assembly of States Parties to push through the reforms that will be needed. Election of stronger and more independent and more courageous judges, election of stronger and more independent and courageous prosecutors, and so on, and then using their annual oversight meetings to actually push the court to perform. So should the other 22 states that have not yet, African states that have not yet joined the Rome Statute system join, there'll be 55. There'd be a very powerful bloc within the ICC, and they should use that to protect lives and to give lives of dignity to Africans, but also because we're interested in other parts of the world, to ensure other parts of the world also enjoy, citizens from other parts of the world, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, enjoy as much protection as possible.
Deya, we've had a extremely fascinating discussion. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but the debate will continue online. That is, people still can participate in our poll of whether other African countries should follow the path that's looking to be set by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in leaving the International Criminal Court. There are some very good, solid, concrete measures that can be taken to restore the credibility of this threatened tribunal. I think you've outlined them extremely clearly today. So I thank you for your time. Once again, to our readers and to our viewers, you can still make your voices heard. We will be reading them all and continuing, no doubt, to refer to this fascinating debate and topic. Do join us again on the next episode of Africa News Debates. That's it.